In the following extracts from our recent CRA client webinar unpacking the 2024 medium-term budget policy statement, analyst Anlu Keeve looks at a range of matters, including the debt to GDP ratio, growth prospects, and others. If you would like access to the full webinar recording, as well as more information about all the other services that we offer at the CRA, including weekly risk alerts, monthly macro reviews on topics such as demographics, education, healthcare, and investment, as well as access to the Socioeconomic Survey of South Africa and the CRA's 24/7 data and research query service, please contact us at the link below.
So, important to mention, the MTBPS revised gross tax revenue down by 22.3 billion rand to just over 1.8 trillion rand. And the main reason for this, we can discuss it a little bit later again, but is weaker than expected fuel levy and VAT collections. So we'll first go in to have a look at the revenue composition. Where does the revenue for the government come from? And for this, we see the graph on the slide. So here the slide shows us the revised revenue distribution by tax type. And what we see here is that nearly 60% of all government revenue comes from personal and corporate tax. So why does this matter? Well, firstly, it matters because it means that the government depends on a small group of taxpayers to carry a majority of the budget. And we call this a narrow tax base. So what does a narrow tax base look like? You can have a look on the next slide. What we see here is that 95%, so have a look, that would be on your right hand, the orange and the yellow. 95% of the personal income tax paid are paid by 30% of the registered taxpayers. That's your left orange and yellow bars. This means that there's only a few people that pay almost everything in the personal income tax. And it means that any changes made to tax affects a certain group more than it affects other groups. And in very simple terms, it means that we can't really increase our tax revenue. And the Minister of Finance knows this, which is also why it's likely the reason why the MTBPS announced additional funding for the revenue service. In the 2022 period, financial year, which is our latest available tax data, we see that there was just over 7 million taxpayers expected to submit. But of these, only 6 million were actually assessed. At the end of the day, increasing efficiency of revenue collection is the only way for them to actually increase it because we have such a narrow tax base. And it means that we see government has a lot of difficult choices that they need to make. So here we see a stacked area chart, and it shows us how expenditure is allocated. We can see that the budget areas, they compete for funding. We see some shrink, especially if you have a look at the top red line, it's debt servicing costs. And we can see it pushing down, especially towards the right-hand corner. We can see it pushing down on all of the rest of the budget areas. And debt servicing cost is our single largest expenditure item. And if you take it into comparison, we spend almost 1.5 times more on paying off our debt than we spend on all our troops in military, the police force, and our judges and courts combined. It's shocking. Other aspect of the budget that we need to consider is the public service wage bill, which is in this graph included in the orange area. But we'll move on to the next slide to have get a better idea of what this actually looks like. If you have a look at this graph, you'll see on the red line, that's where South Africa is at. It's 14% of GDP, again for 2022, which is our latest tax data. And it's relatively higher than the 11% percentage of GDP average for OECD countries. And it gives us a good idea of just how big our public service wage bill is. So what did we see the minister suggest or propose be done about this yesterday? So what they said is, well, let's introduce early retirement. And just to give you an idea of what this means, so early retirement often targets senior employees and they have higher salaries. And in this sense, it's a way for them to reduce their payroll expenses because younger employees, they enter at a much lower salary band. But there's a few risks here, and I think it's important that we actually highlight them. The first being, we need the institutional capacity that comes with more senior employees. And when they leave, they take the years of experience that they have with them. And then you have to consider that induction periods, especially among the youth, it costs time, it costs us production, and at the end of the day, money. And then the last very serious risk, I think, here is the fact that early retirement also means that many of the pension funds need to pay out earlier and for much longer. And if it's not carefully managed, there's a very serious risk that they might require additional funding at a later stage. So what we see here, the point of it is the deficit over time. We can see that the red bars show our expenditure, and they're consistently higher than the black bars, which show our revenue. The important point here is the orange line. The only time that we had a surplus was between 2006 and 2008. And that was under Finance Minister Trevor Manuel. And then we have a look, so that's the upward trend that you can see there. You can see the high point. Then we have a look at the 2020. We saw a worsening of the deficit, quite a bad one actually. And then we have a look at the last red and black line, and those are the current revised estimates from the mini budget, which puts us at 4.7% of GDP. And the forecast is then the light and the dark gray ones, which, yeah, it's forecasted to, in the medium term, improve to 3.4% of GDP deficit. Last year, I'm sure you've heard, but it's very interesting and definitely important. We've had, for the first time in 15 years, the first primary surplus again, which means that before we pay any interest of our debt, we have enough money to pay our day-to-day expenditure. And it's estimated to rise to 1.8% of GDP over the medium term, which National Treasury thinks should be enough to stabilize debt at around 75.5% in the 2025-26 financial year. Wonderful. So before we look at the graph, I'd like to just mention that we're currently at, it's an estimated 22 cents of every tax rand collected that our debt servicing cost is costing us. But to me, cents is sometimes a little bit difficult to understand. So instead, imagine 220 rand and what you can do with it. And then think of every 1,000 rand that you pay in tax, 220 rand of it cannot be used productively for services. And then we consider the graph. So if you have a look at the start of our democratic era, on the far left, debt was around 50%, just under, up or down a little bit. Then around 2007-08, we managed to cut that in half, which is very impressive. And that was under Trevor Manuel's second budget. And then we tripled it to 75%, which is the latest estimate.
Other points of interest. Anlu, just to kick us off in the discussion, so economic growth prospects. The Bureau for Economic Research has a forecast of 3.3% for next year. I'm very much in favor of stretch goals and stretch targets. I hope that materializes. But despite the electricity constraint seemingly now alleviated, I don't know if that alone gets us to that 3.3%. Earlier this year, we had 0.7%, and now the National Treasury is revising down the forecast that it provided in February of 1.3% for this year to 1.1%, and for us to average 1.8% over the next 3 years. Now, maybe if one is kind, you could say they're trying to moderate expectations and maybe trying to, I don't know, what's the right word, put a bit of a dampener just on some of the exuberance that we've seen following the formation of the GNU, because they can always revise upward their growth projections if the economy does start to take off. So what do you think around economic growth implications, some of the forecasting terminology being used by National Treasury? Yeah, maybe a comment on that.
Perfect. Yeah. So I think important to mention is just to quickly give the idea, it's very obvious, but it's a very important point. And I think people often see it over because it's so obvious. More growth means more tax, which means more revenue. And that's why growth matters. And if we have a look at, so what we saw in the mini budget is lots of focus on infrastructure and reforms. And I think there is reason to be optimistic. There's lots of potential growth that can come from, say, Operation Vulindlela. And the Minister of Finance mentioned quite a few good progress areas that they had with specifically the operation. And I think they adjust their forecasts accordingly. I don't think it shows enough confidence, but I think it's a conservative effort to show that they still do believe there is potential. I think they're being conservative in the medium term, at least, for the reason. So let me say there's two reasons that I think it's the case. Firstly, we've seen a revenue shortfall this year, 22.3 billion. I should mention that the previous year it was 60 billion, I think. So it's a little bit less, but we still have it's a very big revenue shortfall. And then very important is that the growth that they at the moment professing in that sense, that they're putting forward, it'll come from capital intensive markets instead of profit intensive markets. And what this means is that, so because the focus is on infrastructure, there is very high upfront costs. But in the long run, you see a much bigger multiplier effect. And what would have been the case if it was profit intensive markets is that we would have seen immediate GDP growth, fast GDP growth, and quick returns on our investments, but much shorter growth cycles. So in that sense, I think it gives us a bit of insight into also why over the medium term, they need to stay conservative in terms of their growth projections.